In today's video, we're going to cover making chill old school beats. I'm going to show you sampling techniques, unique sound design tips, sound selection ideas, helpful effects, and a lot more. So let's get into it. Now the biggest thing about these beats is that they have a very specific sound and feel to them, but it's hard to know how to achieve this, which might be something you find difficult. When you try to make this style of beat, it ends up sounding incomplete or the aesthetic feels off. So let's cover some key concepts on how to achieve this. Starting from the top, let's talk about sample selection. Now there are lots of ways to make these styles of beats, and I'm going to cover what I find helps me the most. Now one of the most important characteristics about these beats is that most of the instruments sit in a very specific frequency range, which is the low mid and or the mid. And I'm going to explain why this is important later on. For now, let's just find a sample with this characteristic. So using a sample like this might not get us the results that we want for this style of beat. This has instrumentation that sits higher up in the frequency spectrum. So let's look elsewhere. One of the things that I like to do is look for older songs to sample. The reason why is because a lot of modern recordings have a brightness to them, which I don't want at times. In terms of genre, looking in the jazz or the soul sections could be a good idea. These genres often have instruments that sit in that right frequency space, like Fender Rhodes, for example. Those are very common in these types of genres. But I'm going to get a little bit more experimental, and I'm going to look in the soundtrack library section. You can at times find some more unique textures in this area. So this is an interesting sample. It has sounds that sit near that frequency space that I want, and the song also has a degraded sound quality, which is exactly what I want. So this ticks all the boxes. Let's see what we can do with this sample. And by the way, before I start chopping the sample up, I actually want to let you know that I've been reading up on subliminal messaging and how to influence people to get them to do what you want without them even knowing it. So at some point during this video, I will be dropping a subliminal message on you. You probably won't even realize it, but it will work and I will brainwash you. Anyways, let's go ahead and chop this sample up. What? How did this get here? What? So there are parts of the sample that do have more typical sounds, like this piano area over here, that could definitely work. But I sort of like these spacier sounds over here. So starting off using these pieces here, I'm going to build something really basic. I don't need to get super complicated, I can just start simple. So this simple 2-chop progression is working. By the way, how I decided to make these chops was by listening to what was happening at a more fundamental level. Let me show you what I mean by using an EQ here. So here, if I isolate just this lower frequency area, this is the instrument that I chose to chop around instead of the sound up here. By focusing on that lower frequency sound, I was able to piece something that made sense musically a lot easier. This is something that I talked about in my video covering Ninth Wonder, where I talked about focusing on the right sounds in your sample when making your chops. It just makes things a little bit easier. So with this progression that I've built here, I can even figure out what the root notes are by playing another instrument alongside my sample. So I'm just going to go ahead and open a random synth here. And I'm just going to play along with the sample until I find what 2 notes work here. And there we go. Now I know which notes work, and this was just made a little bit more easy just because I built a very simple framework with my sample. And I actually like the way this instrument sounds too, so I might save this for later on. We'll see. I also want to point out a small little tip here. Take a look at the velocities of these chops. You'll notice that the first chop is higher than my second chop. The reason why I did this is if you look at the sample itself in each chop, you'll notice that the first chop is at a lower volume while the second chop is a bit louder in terms of its actual waveform. So to help offset this and get them to sound a little bit more equal and even, I use my velocities. Just a small little tip here that you might want to look out for when you're sampling. Now to go back to my earlier point, most of the sample's presence is in that low mid frequency space, which is exactly what I want. Now let me explain why. Many people often describe these beats as sounding warm. What this means is that many of the instruments lean towards that lower frequency range. They don't have a lot of bright instruments playing within them. But again, doing this might lead you to make beats that sound incomplete. If all of your sounds sit in a lower frequency range, the overall beat might just sound really uneven. What I find helps to fix this problem is to build all of your instruments within these lower frequency regions, but fill up those higher frequency regions artificially. Meaning we won't use actual instruments to fill up these higher frequency areas, but instead we'll use a number of smaller noises and sounds to do this. For example, with this sample, I'm going to apply a few effects here. The most important one being decimort. This is a bit crushing tool that can help you create a lot more presence in the higher frequency regions. Now the sample takes up a lot more of the high end, but it does this in an artificial way. We took our sample, which has its instrumentation that mostly sits in that warm lower space, and we added this layer of noise on top that sits in that higher frequency space. And as we do this to more and more of our sounds, our beat won't sound as incomplete, even if our actual instruments mostly sit in that lower space, because we'll just have a lot of these smaller noises taking up the higher frequency space. So that's a tip that you can use if your beats sound incomplete. As well, another reason that I used bit crushing was to emulate that old school SP1200 feel. This plugin even has an SP1200 preset, just a small little aesthetic tip here. Next, I am going to add an EQ onto this and cut a lot of that high end just because I did think it was a bit much. And the next effect I'm going to add is this one here called Sigmund. This is a plugin that I like to use when I just want to get a little bit more experimental with my sample. It just has a bunch of presets in here that I like to use just to spark new ideas and provide me with some new direction to take my beat that I might not have thought of otherwise. So I like this preset here. It has this gating effect that adds this cool rhythm to my sample. And by no means am I saying this is necessary or anything. I just felt like getting a little bit experimental here. Alright, this layer is sounding cool to me. Moving on to my next layer. Like I mentioned, I want to fill up that higher end, but do so using smaller noises and sounds and avoid using actual musical instruments. And you don't need big expensive plugins or anything to do this. In fact, let's go ahead and use a stock plugin to do this. I'm going to use 3X Oscillator. I know I've said a lot of bad things about 3X Oscillator in the past, but I actually think it's the best plugin in the world now. It has everything you need. It's just so good. I can't believe how good it is. So I apologize for ever saying anything bad about this plugin. It's just so amazing. I love it, and I wish it was my friend because it's just so good and amazing. And just please, everyone, use it. I beg you, just please use it.
Don't ever talk about me again, boy.
Alright, I'm just going to use a GMS here. This is a stock plugin I remember toying with way back, and I remember liking the sound effects area in here. So this is a really cool sound here. I also like this sound here as well. But as of right now, these sounds are probably a bit too loud and prominent and make my beat sound a little bit too bright. So I'm going to take an EQ and really constrict how much space both of these sounds take up. I'm also going to throw some reverb on, and so we get this in the end. So now this just becomes far more of a subtle little texture that slightly fills up a tiny bit of that higher end, and that's exactly what I need out of these sounds. So now that I've built these layers, it does sound like this beat still needs a lot of space filled up, primarily in that lower area like I mentioned. So let's go ahead and add in some more. Now this can get tricky as you add more and more sounds that sit in a very similar space because you risk cluttering up your beat. But if we do this smart, we can avoid this problem. So I'm going to go into my big library of sounds once again and see if I can find a sound that fits. I think I can get this layer to work, but as of right now, it's not sitting in that right space that I need it to. Like I mentioned, I want my next sound to sit in that lower frequency range, so I think playing the sample at a lower octave will get me the results that I'm looking for. We can just hear this difference. This layer now provides a lot of that warmness just by playing the sound at a lower pitch, which gets it to sit in that lower frequency range. And as you can see, since I figured out what root notes work with this sample, if I just literally copy and paste this pattern over, it works perfectly. I'm gonna go ahead and add some effects onto this sound as well. I'm gonna use Super VHS, but primarily just for the magic switch here. It's a chorus effect, which I really like. By the way, I'm pretty sure this is available to download for free off of Baby Audio's site. It's an effect that I use on my Fender Rhodes quite a bit just to create that huge, wide, lush sound like you heard. So yeah, if you're interested in this magic switch here, I'll leave the link to this in the description box below. What I'm going to do next is add an EQ and cut out a lot of the presence outside of this area here. The reason why is because, like I mentioned, it can be really easy for these types of beats to end up sounding cluttered since we're going to be adding a lot of sounds that sit in a very similar frequency zone. So being a little bit more particular with where your sounds sit using an EQ can help with this problem. Here, since I know that I'm going to be adding a few more instruments going forward, I'm going to be a little bit more conservative with how much space this sound takes up. So far so good though. Overall, you can hear there is one big important space that's missing right now in the very low end, so I think it'd be a good idea to add in some bass next. I'm going to use this bass from Contact. This is one of my favorite basses to use for these types of beats. Especially when you add Decapitator onto it, it just becomes so much fatter. Now to build out my actual bass line here. So one thing to point out, you'll notice that since my main loop is basically a 2-bar loop repeating over and over again, I did something slightly different with my bass line, where I created a different little pattern for the 4th bar here, instead of just repeating the exact same thing from the 2nd bar. I just want to create a small little amount of variation, so this beat starts to feel a little bit more like a 4-bar loop rather than a 2-bar loop. Having said that though, this beat does feel simple still. There isn't much musicality in it right now with what I've built, so let's go ahead and add another layer into this beat that's a bit more musical. In terms of what type of sound next, I am again trying to get this beat to sound very warm, so adding yet another sound in that lower frequency space will help achieve this. And hopefully I don't make a mess of my beat by adding too much. So to help make sure that I don't, I think it'd be a good idea to go back into my bass and actually cut out some of the frequencies outside of what I just need, just to make a little bit more room for the next layer that I want to add in. And here for sound choice, I'm actually going to use another bass guitar. But what I'm going to do is use an EQ to take out everything from the low end. Again, I already have my bass in the low end. I just more so want to use this texture for its color in that low mid region. And like I mentioned, this beat lacks a little bit of musicality right now, so I'm going to use this sound to help with that problem and just create a pattern that's a bit more musical. So I think I have an idea. In these more open spaces in the 2nd and 4th bar, I'm gonna sort of do an A-B back and forth type of pattern. So I'm gonna grab another guitar sound here. Here I just went into Omnisphere and grabbed a jazzy guitar since I think that will fit into the aesthetic of this type of beat. I'm just gonna build a sort of A-B pattern. Alright, so I actually like this sort of back and forth pattern. It sounds cool to me, but I don't actually like the way this guitar is sitting in the beat, so let's do something about that. Here are the effects that I use. The most important one's probably voodoo here. So that's creating that sort of flanging feel to this guitar. This plugin is specifically made for guitars, but at times I use this on random sounds or samples just to be a little bit more experimental as well. And after using these effects, you can hear these two guitars just sound a little bit different from each other, which helps that sort of A-B pattern type of idea. So far, I like the way this beat sounds. I think it has a good amount of layers in it. The only thing that's left is the drums. Most likely I'm gonna have to be a little bit more simple with my drum pattern since this beat already has a lot going on in it. So starting off, I'm gonna create this very basic hi-hat pattern. This sounds very subdued. One tip that I want to point out is that initially this hi-hat sort of fit, but I didn't really like how much attack it had. It was a bit too piercing for what I needed. So one trick that I like to do at times when I have this problem is I normalize my hi-hat and then I slowly play with the start time. You can hear the tone of the hi-hat subtly changes depending on which section of the hi-hat you choose to start at. For me, since I have a lot happening in my beat and I want my drums to be a little bit more subdued, I chose a part of the hi-hat that just sounds a little bit less prominent. Another thing that I did with this hi-hat was I added reels onto it, partly to degrade the sound and get it to sound a little bit more dirty and get rid of those high-end frequencies. But another reason why I wanted to use this is because Reels has a noise creation section. You can hear this if I crank it up. So this again goes to the idea of filling up the high end using noise. Here I'm using static instead of an actual instrument to fill up this high end space. Next up we have the kick and the snare here. More Beat Batter sounds, so again, shout out to them. They do awesome work, so I'll leave a link to their drum kits in the description box below as well. One thing to point out here, once again, I did use some parallel compression. And here I just use the exact same technique that I showed you in my last Overexplained video. So if you haven't watched that, I cover a lot more tips and techniques. So if you're getting all hot and sweaty from watching this video, you'll be drenched after watching that one. By the way, all the videos and links that I mentioned are in the description box below too. But anyways, let's go ahead and arrange this beat now. Now, I already did this joke once. Am I even funny anymore? Have I lost all creativity? What's that smell? Anyways, a couple things I want to point out with the actual arrangement. I ended up using that cool synth that I liked way back at the beginning of the video. I used it during the hook section here. I also reduced the amount of layers playing during all the different sections here. Just because I don't want to overproduce, I tend to lean towards underproducing and using less of my layers during my beat, just to be on the safe side, just because I know us producers have a tendency to do too much. Anyways, enough jibber jabber, here is the full beat, but before I play it, if you want to watch another video on boom bap techniques, check out the video in the corner. Again, all the videos that I mentioned are in the description box below, same with my free drum kit. And if you want to check out my online beat making course, head over to betterbeatmaker.com. Like and subscribe, and here's the full beat.